Hello there, so I am collecting information from many mappers, one of which is you. Could you send me the names of 3 mappers who influenced your mapping the most? My interest in the connections between different mappers has been growing as of recently. Those interview videos have been a sign of it, as well as a motivator for me to learn more, and there was one part of that first interview I decided would be worth digging deep into. Mappers are people, they come and go, and those who are new usually take inspiration from those who are active in recent history. Yeah, right there, the sample chart showing how mappers in different time periods are influenced by the mappers who came before them. That can exist in more than just theory. Skystar sent me a message shortly after the Hands-On video released. Let's make a mapper influence chart from the ancient era to the modern era. And I was immediately hooked. Everyone talks about how they draw mapping ideas from mapper X, and mapper X draws from mapper Y, who draws from mapper Z, and so on. We speculate based on mapping choices, we make associations between maps, and we claim one thing led to the other. But it's rare to really know for sure who affects who. The threads connecting mappers aren't always clear, and the further back you try deducing, the more unclear it becomes. Imagine a scenario where those threads were all visible though. Like from now all the way back, you could fully trace the lineage of mappers. You could see how people indirectly passed on mapping ideas from the earlier eras, and through that, which mappers had the biggest impact on how mapping progressed. That scenario is raw mapper ecstasy. It makes me giddy to think about, and despite how unachievable it should be, my addiction forced me to try and make it real. That message, the one I read at the beginning, was sent in one way or another to tons of different mappers. They were asked for the names of up to 3 mappers who heavily influenced their mapping. That's it. Data collection took place throughout a month, and over 1,000 responses later, the imaginary scenario became a reality through this, and this. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You've probably got some questions about how everything was set up. First, I said the message was sent to mappers. Which mappers specifically though? Essentially everyone who ranked a standard OSU map. People in that group have most likely spent enough time mapping to have taken influence from other mappers. Unfortunately, some people who name changed after ranking their latest map, and everyone restricted were excluded from this though. Not much could be done about that given how the OSU API displays map info, and for the most part, that turned out okay. Second question, why only up to 3 names? Most mappers have been influenced or inspired by more than 3 people, but to achieve decent results from this survey, I'd say a limit was necessary. If I listed 10 mappers who influenced me, I doubt all 10 would have the same effect on my mapping. Narrowing it down to only 3 people means deciding who had the biggest impact, and that impact is what I hope to see through these responses. Third question, I asked for who influenced each mapper. What does influence mean here? Some people wondered if that was referring to copying ideas directly from maps, while others thought it was influenced through learning mapping ideas from someone else. For the sake of the survey, I think either worked fine. Whichever someone interpreted as more important was what had more impact on them, which again is what I wanted to see here. The last questions go hand in hand. Why not explain the purpose to anyone, and why keep responses private for so long? I tried to keep the message sent as simple as possible. It was just a question for vague research because if I gave too much detail, people wouldn't want to read it, and also if I said what it was for, some people's answers might change. Similarly, if I asked everyone to post their answers in a straw poll or forum thread, they would be affected by each other's answers. This probably did happen in some capacity because people discussed their answers, but to the minimum extent at least. I wanted to get answers in something close to a vacuum, and a one-on-one simple question seemed like the best choice for that. Out of 1,775 people contacted, 1,035 people responded with a total of 2,725 names, and 33 nones. And 8 people who set the original DS game. That's a lot of info, more info than is possible to explain with words, which is why a basic website was developed to display it. Big thanks to Milan and Ringating for the bulk of this because I suck at programming. Link is in the description. The main page of the website is for looking up the influences of specific users. Enter a name of someone who responded, and you'll see that user along with their listed influences. Clicking on anyone below them will open up a new branch from which you can see that user's influences and so on until you reach a dead end, either caused by some old guy who didn't respond or people who said they had no major influences. In other words, it ends when you reach DJ Pop and James. They're some of the most commonly recurring names who both started mapping around the time when OSU began, and neither said they took influence from anyone else. When hovering over a name, you can also see the amount of time someone was included as an influence. Then clicking on that shows those influencees, mentioners, you know what I mean. This is nice because it gives you some other names to search if you want to potentially see more relationships between mappers. And lastly, there's a button to view the beatmap section of someone's profile. Extremely useful once you get into the depths of a branch and you see names you don't recognize. The second page of the website is admittedly way less practical, but still interesting to explore. It's the fleshed out version of that theoretical chart I referenced earlier, with mapper names and arrows physically connecting them based on their responses. The time each name appears is based on their first ranked map, since it's usually after that point that their influence takes effect. Vertically, names are sorted based on the amount of mentions they received. At the bottom is a minimum of 1 mention, then it goes up to 2 and 3, and near the top, scaling gets kinda weird. So how are you supposed to interpret any of this? There's 2 lines attached to each person's box. One sticks out from the right and leads into arrows pointing at other names from the left, showing that this guy influenced this guy. Branching and connecting paths make this look confusing sometimes, but they're really simple. For example, the mapper Echo influenced multiple people. One branch leads into M980, another into Mifune24, and another into Sinistro. Each of those guys were influenced by other people as well, which attached to those new branches. No branches connect in ways that make it unclear where they're headed, so you shouldn't have trouble seeing user relationships. What I should also make clear is who is on this chart. It's not everyone who responded. I wanted to showcase the connections between mappers, so I decided to only include people who were mentioned as influences by people who were also mentioned as influences. So someone with 0 mentions wouldn't show up, and someone with 2 mentions from people who had 0 mentions each also wouldn't show up. Only people who have a base level of cross-user impact would appear because that's the most interesting thing for a chart showing cross-user impact. Lastly, adding to the mess of this is the colors. They are actually meaningless. All they do is help you keep track of what line you're following, which is useful in the more crowded areas. And let's not talk about how this was made. Yeah, okay. So what is there to take away from this chart? When looking at the big picture, what immediately stands out to me is density. Because there were less responses from the earlier times, lines are fairly sparse. As time goes on, we head into messy territory, which peaks around 2012 to 2013. The decline from there is pretty slow until about 2015, when there's a huge drop-off in lines and names. This isn't because mappers from then on aren't influential, but rather because mappers influenced by the people in this time haven't begun influencing others yet. It's mostly a matter of how time is organized here. Obviously, most people's first maps aren't influential, but you could just mentally shift everyone forward a year or 2 if you want to know where they really started making a difference. If I made this chart 2 years from now, I imagine this section would be just as dense as this. All that said, have fun looking through the chart in its ugly upscaling glory. While the 2 pages so far have been focused on individuals, the last page of the website displays the most interesting overall stats. You could check them out yourself, or I could give my comments on them here instead. Who got the most mentions? Skystar was mentioned 98 times, which was about 9.5% of total responders. Monstrata was next in line with 92, then RLC with 89, a big skip down to me with 69, and Natsume Rin with 57. Numbers are a bit more steady past the first 5 names, slowly lowering down into the 30s, then 20s, then way more teens, and more than 400 users with single-digit mentions. This shows a small handful of mappers influenced a huge number of people. Half the total mentions went to the top 43 people, who make up about 2.5% of the people on my list. It's also worth noting what years the highest mentioned users came from. With the exception of Monstrata, everyone in the top 36 ranked their first map in 2014 or earlier, with no clear leaning towards any year in particular. The first person from 2016 is Laura with 12 mentions, appearing 53rd in the list, and the first from 2017 is Mir with 5 mentions, appearing 127th. This shouldn't be a surprise though. Just like the chart, it again shows how the older generations have had more time to influence mappers. Examining how influential these mappers are another level down is where it gets most interesting though. Like, Skystar influenced 98 people. How many times were those 98 people mentioned by others as being influential? In this case, 274. In RLC's case, 200, and in Natsume Rin's case, 231. Going by a ratio of mentions to secondary mentions, Natsume Rin is indirectly more influential than the top 4, followed by DJ Pop. Pretty clear bias towards older mappers, right? This is even more obvious when you compare me and Monstrata to the other highly mentioned people. We influence a lot of the general public, but do we influence many other influential mappers? If you take away my mention of Monstrata, he's got 33 indirect influences and I've got 27. That's barely anything compared to the big guys surrounding us. Geography is a pretty interesting factor too. Counting up total mentions for people in each country, China is the most influential, no surprise there, followed by the US, Japan, Canada, Hong Kong, Russia, Korea, you can read all the rest. What's worth noting here is how mentions are spread within countries though. The US and Canada have 5 people above 10 mentions, while China has 11 people, so they have a lot more individually influential people. Most countries also seem to only have 2 or 3 people who are big influences, while everyone else only has a few mentions. Exceptions to this are mostly in countries with the highest language barriers, like China, Japan, Korea, and Russia. People, I assume, learn more internally there, whereas North America and Europe mostly communicate in English and therefore share ideas. At least, that's what I'm taking away from the info. that's enough about mentions though. I wanted to go through some response rate stats as well, since those are cool in their own way. For example, I like how clearly time affected who replied to the message. Organizing people again by the date of their first ranked map, there was a steady increase in how many people responded. 19.4% of all 2070 users gave answers, which is pretty high considering almost all of them are long gone now, and in the few months of 2018 so far, 96.2% of all people replied. Looking at the top mentioned users again, response rate was especially high. Everyone in the top 20 provided answers, including Lardo, who hasn't logged into the game in 6 years. Only 5 people were missing from the top 50 as well, and only 12 people from the top 100. In general though, I noticed that influential people were also the most frequent to respond. This may just have to do with how much they care about Osu. If they spent enough time in the game to make an impact, they're more willing to respond to a PM long after they're inactive, compared to someone who ranked a hard diff then went on with their lives. And last thing, I have nowhere else to mention this, for being highly influential mappers, Lan Wings and Taeying have some really weird choices. Most people are influenced by common mappers, these guys not so much though. But anyway, a bit of housekeeping, then we're done here. First, despite how much I've said things like top X mentioned or place 50th, I want to remind people that nothing here is a competition. The most mentioned people aren't the best mappers and the least mentioned aren't the worst or anything like that. All this does is show connections between mappers and their mapping choices, which is cool in my opinion. Second, will I keep this up to date? Like when people feel their influences have changed or when new people become mappers? The answer is no, for reasons I've already explained. With everyone's choices so far public, anyone changing or newly responding is affected by the results, so I'd rather not skew them at all. Treat this like a snapshot of the mapping scene's influences in May 2018, not beyond. And lastly, what I hope people find useful about this whole setup, seeing mapping from viewpoints before their own. There's a lot of people whose mapping made a difference in various times. I, making mapping videos, should be someone who knows a lot about mapping, but I don't know so many names like Shingsin, Lace, Teef, Darihuka, and Alazif on the level they seem to deserve based on how many people they've impacted. This website is a tool to learn about mapper connections and maps, so try to get some use out of it. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next week.